Today we're going to be working on making a 3D cutout landscape. I'm going to stick with the spring theme, and some supplies that you'll need are some watercolor paper. So you can get watercolor paper like $6.99 at Hobby Lobby. You'll want some brushes. I have watercolor brushes, but you can use regular brushes for this as well. You'll want some tape. Clear Scotch tape would be best, but I have masking tape, so that's what I'm going to use. You'll want a pencil, scissors, and you'll want a watercolor palette, as well as a mister spray bottle. So to start out, you're going to want 4 sheets of your watercolor paper. Now that we have our 4 sheets together, you're going to want to lay them flat next to each other, line them up, and tape them together. Now you'll want to figure out how you're going to fold your piece so that you don't show the tape. So we'll want to hide the tape. So the way that I would end up folding mine would be like this. And now that we have that figured out, we know that this part will be the foreground. And this back part will be our sky, and then our background and midground. So we'll want to take our pencil and plan out our different layers of our landscape. So again, this part is going to be the sky, so I'm just going to curve the edges off here and make it look a little more whimsical. The next sheet is our landscape. I think I'm going to make the next sheet is our background, so I'm going to make this part mountains. So you'll want to make sure that you put your mountains low enough in your skyline so that you can still see your sky, so don't put it at the very top of the page. Now that I have the background, I'm going to move on to the midground. Again, you're going to want this lower than your background, so that way you can still see your background image. This I'm going to make more like rolling hills. Then now that we got the background and the midground done, we're going to move on to the foreground. This is going to be the smallest part, and this is also the one that you're going to cut the most material off of. Make sure that you make the seam pretty seamless. So you just want to take that line from your midground and bring it down. And so I just made mine a slant. So then you're going to end up with something like this. So this is going to be the skyline. You can see where I rounded the corners. The mountains are the background. Midground is this curve. And then your foreground is just this small little valley area. So you're going to want to go ahead now and cut the top out. And you're going to want to keep your scrap pieces because we're going to add some extra parts to our landscape. And this is what we've got so far. So we've got our skyline, our background, our midground, and then our foreground up in front. And this is going to be really cool once we color it and add some extra elements to our landscape. So now you're just going to want to fold some of these over so you have your skyline, and you're going to use some watercolors and make your sky. Oh, you're also going to want paper towels since you're using watercolors to clean off your brushes. Just mist your watercolors and let them soak for a minute so that the color activates. Pick out a big brush to get the most covered as quickly as possible, since this doesn't need to be super detailed for your skyline. I like to do wetting the page first and then adding the color. You get a more even wash that way, or more even coverage. Just remember that with this watercolor paper, it really eats that water, so you're going to have to work in smaller sections if you're using a smaller brush. Wetting the paper first and then adding your color is a great way to get gradients in your wash as well. And it's okay to leave some white space in the sky. That will look like clouds. Don't feel like you have to cover the entire page in blue. But again, you can if you want to. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And since this is a 3D landscape, it would be great if you can fill the whole page, so that way when it's accordioned out, you still get that sense of the piece being complete. If you don't fill the entire page full, and then it's, you know, out like that, it kind of takes away from the art. Okay, we're almost to the bottom of the page, so then we'll let this layer dry. I'll grab some water, and then we can move on to our next layer. Alright, so we have our finished, for now, sky. And we can add extra details once this first layer dries, like we can add some birds in the sky or maybe a sun. But for now we're going to need to let this dry. So what you can do is you can take a smaller brush and get that ready, and then you'll want to wet the black in your palette. And we can add some birds to our sky. And don't take too much black on your brush because a little goes a long way with this for sure. Alright, and I'm going to add them in the left corner. So just make little V's, little fat V's. I'll show you here in just a second what they look like. If you ever get too much water on a section of your paper, grab paper towel and blot it one time. Don't blot a bunch because then you'll mix your colors together and it'll look really bad. But if you blot it one time and just set it there for a minute, you can grab that extra water. So what I did is I had too much water on my brush, and then I had this big spot on my bird, and it didn't look very good. So I just blotted it to get that water off. So now I have little birds in the corner, and they look like this. A really neat trick I found for making a sun, and I'll show you how to do that actually, is taking your middle finger and putting it in your paint and just rubbing it gently in the paint and picking some pigment up. And then just find a section where you want your sun and just make a really small circle on that section. That way you get a pretty close to perfect circle every time. Like that. It's a little muddy. I picked up a bit too much paint, but normally that works really well. So moving on to our next layer, we have our mountains. So what colors do you think the mountains should be? I'm thinking I'm going to make my mountains purple, because why not? So make sure to wet your color and grab a brush. You can use the same one you used for your sky, just make sure that you wipe it off on a paper towel to get that extra color off. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and wet this layer first. And again, you're going to want to fill the entire page so that when it's popped out, it doesn't take away from the art. That way your eyes can look over the whole piece and your eyes won't be interrupted by missing paint. And a really cool thing you can do is do short little dabs with a flat brush, and it adds some texture to mountains. Now if you didn't do mountains, you know, you can be creative and play around and see what works for you, what kind of textures you can put into your piece. Don't ever be afraid to experiment. That's how you learn. And another thing, when you're painting and your layers are stacked like this, be really careful not to get it onto your sky layer. Don't get that purple paint on your sky. A neat trick you can do is you can always put a paper towel in between your layers. I don't need to do that, but you know, if you're working with younger kids or you're a younger kid, maybe try that to make sure that you don't ruin your sky. Another cool way to get texture, especially with a mountain, is letting your brush dry a little bit, and then when you pull it through, it leaves some white parts and it almost looks like it's snow on your mountain. And then as you bring your landscape down, you can just freehand some smaller mountains as you go down. They don't have to be super defined, or they can be, it's totally up to you. But it's a great way to fill this space and make it stay interesting instead of just a flat like purple. If you just add some shapes in there, it can really bring a lot of attention to all the work you did. Sorry about that, I had some technical difficulties. So we just finished our background. So you've done your purple mountains. Now we'll go ahead and fold over to our next part of our landscape, which is our midground. And for this part of our landscape, we have these rolling hills. So I'm thinking I'm going to make those green, and I'm going to make them a light green because usually the farther away something is, the lighter it is, and the closer it is to you, the darker that is, because you're closer, it's more vibrant. When it's farther away, usually things aren't as detailed, so we don't need to worry too much about like adding like grass texture for this part. We're just gonna make this more of like a solid or mostly solid light green color. So make sure to wet your palette again and get your brushes ready. You can use the same one you used for the mountain, just make sure to clean it on a paper towel. And make sure when you're painting at the top of this that you aren't getting your green grass color onto your mountains. So you can always try putting a paper towel in between your layers or lifting them up just a little bit so that they're not touching while you paint. And something you might notice when you're painting is that your layers will start to curl a little bit, and that's normal and it's okay. All we have to do to fix that is put a heavy flat book on top of our project overnight, and it'll flatten up on its own. So don't worry about that. It's not the end of the world. It's always fixable. And another thing I want to try to do is as you're going along, try to follow the curve of the landscape. Don't just paint up and down or straight side to side. Try to follow those curves to give your landscape more depth and make it look a little more realistic. And one thing you're going to notice when I show you my painting is that there are some areas where the color has started to peel up, and that's happening because I'm using such a cheap watercolor palette, unfortunately. But I mean, the nice thing is it's really easy to fix. You just let your piece dry and you can rub that extra off and you can just repaint over it. There is always a way to fix your art. Don't ever feel like something's ruined just because it didn't turn out the way you expected. Be creative and think of a solution. So you should be almost to the bottom of your page if you aren't already. And then we're gonna need to let this dry. And then we'll move on to our next layer, our final layer, the foreground, which is the closest layer of the landscape to you. And in that layer, we're gonna want our grass to be dark. So if you don't have a dark green in your palette, we can mix your green with just a little bit of black to darken it up. It's always important to add black sparingly and a little bit at a time. You can always make something darker, but once you put too much black in it, you're not going to be able to make it lighter. Don't feel like you can then add white. You know, obviously with watercolors that's not possible, but in general, if you're mixing paints, you can't just add white to lighten your color. It's going to make it really muddy. So always be sparing with black. Alright, so now that our midground is done and you have your grass, we'll move on to our foreground once this layer is dry. I'm going to show you the peeling color I was talking about. You can see all those dots on there. Don't panic if that happens. It is fixable. Just let it dry and then I'll show you how to fix that later, okay? And maybe while that dries, we can talk about the different elements we're going to add to our landscape. So take your scrap paper from earlier and tear off one sheet. And we're going to think about what we can add to our landscape. So I would discourage you from adding anything to the very far background because you're not going to get a bunch of details when you're that far away. Your eyes wouldn't normally pick that up. So the parts of the landscape you're going to want to focus on adding extra parts to would be your midground and your foreground. So I'm thinking in my midground, I want to add a little house and maybe a little tree. And then in our foreground later on, I'm actually going to add a little person. So I'm going to go ahead and make the tree and the house on our scrap piece of paper. So if you take your scrap paper and your pencil, you can go ahead and sketch out what you want your tree and your house to look like. And you're going to want to make them just a little bit longer than you normally would because we're going to end up putting them under the layer and taping them down. So what you can do is you can grab your landscape and your tree and play around with it and see if your tree is the size you want it to be. And I think that's a good size for our tree. Don't cut it out yet. You're going to want to paint it first, let it dry, and then cut it out. Because if you cut it out and then paint it, you're going to make a big mess. And I want my tree to stand out, so I'm going to use a darker green for the leaves. I'm going to set this aside to let it dry, and then our midground should be dry. Yep. Alright, so all that paint that was peeling up, just gently take your hand and rub that off. And it should just come right off. And if you have any spots where the paint came up, you can just go over it again with the same color. Alright, so mine looks okay now. I'm not going to repaint it. And now you'll see that all those specks are gone. And we're gonna move on to our foreground. I'm gonna make this a darker green color. And this is really the layer you're gonna wanna focus on adding some texture. So you can try to flick your brush to make the grass on the bottom. It might be a little harder with your watercolors, but again, just do your best and have fun with it more than anything. So we should be finishing up the bottom part of our painting. We'll go ahead and set that aside and we'll keep working on those elements that we're going to add to our background. So we have the tree done, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to sketch out our little house that we're going to want to add. And think about your house in relation to this tree. How big do you want the house in comparison to it? I think I want my house to look smaller than my tree because I want it to look like it's farther away. And you can add all sorts of details to your house, and when you paint over them with the watercolor, the pencil will show through, so your details won't go away. That also means if you don't want something to show up, you're going to need to erase it first. Otherwise, you won't be able to erase it once you put the paint on top of it. So then you're going to want to think about what color you want your house to be. I'm thinking I'm going to make mine a reddish brown brick color with a black roof. And I'm going to add the black roof. Be really careful if you have two wet colors next to each other because they will bleed together if you touch them. So, it might be a good idea for you to wait to do the roof, if it's going to be a different color, until the first color dries. I'm more experienced, so I was able to do them at the same time, but you know, if you're working with a younger child, you might want them to do one color and then let that dry and then do the next color. So now we've got the house done. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to add a person to this front layer. So I'm going to go ahead and draw her as well. This is nice because if you're working with younger kids, you can they can be creative and draw however they like, and older kids can add extra detail to this as well. It's really one of those projects where you can use it throughout different grade levels, just advancing the skill the farther up you go. And I'm going to put my person sitting on the ground, almost like she's having a picnic. Alright, and then once you have them sketched out, again you can just start painting them. And this would be a good opportunity to work with your kids and teach them how to mix colors to get the skin tone for their person right. So for me, I would need a very light tannish pinkish color. Now I actually have a color similar to what I would need available, but if you didn't, say all you have is a regular red color, you could take some of that and put it to the side of your palette, and you'll see just how bright it is. And then what you will want to do is water it down. So just grab some of that and add it to a new puddle until you end up with a very light pink color. And another way to control the color you're going to use is to wet the drawing first with water and then add little bits of the color at a time. I'm lucky I mixed a pretty accurate color right off the bat. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the shoes, which I'm going to make them black. And be really careful when you're working with black, especially with watercolors, because you can't go over it with a different color after you use black. So if you go outside your lines, well, whatever you went outside your lines on is going to end up black too, or at least part of it. And again, if you're working with little kids, make sure that they do one color at a time and let the next color dry. Otherwise, they're going to end up with muddy colors mixing together. So we know that our tree is dry, so we can go ahead and cut that out. So grab your scissors. And to make it easier, you can always cut that out from your other items, since these ones are still drying. Alright, so we have our tree cut out. We're going to throw our scraps away, and then we are going to grab our landscape and place our tree where we want it. And how we're going to do that, so we're going to look at our landscape and our tree, and we want it to be on this middle ground right here. This light green color. So what we're going to do is place it behind like this against the paper, and then we will tape right across the back. So I think I want my tree to be right here. So I'm going to grab some tape. And make sure it's long enough to grab all of your tree and part of the rest of the paper. And we're going to tape it flat. So that'll look like this on the back, and then it'll stand up like this. And I'm going to take a very small amount of tape, very small amount, and you can curl your tape on top of itself into a little tape tube. Or if you have double-sided tape, that would be the best thing to use, but this works as well. You're going to stick it onto the back of your house, and then you're just going to find a place on your landscape where you want to place your house now. Try to make it so that part of the top of it is sticking up over the green edge of the landscape. So it looks like it's sitting on that layer instead of being like right in the middle of it. So then it ends up looking like that. And we're gonna do the same thing with our person actually, because they're going to be sitting on top of this layer, the foreground layer. And this is probably going to be the most complicated shape you're going to have to cut out. So again, if you're working with little kids, make sure you give them a hand on this stage. So now that our little person's cut out, we're going to grab our tape and we're going to put it on the back of their bottom. So just fold your tape over like before, make a little tube of tape, and mine is a little big. So I'm going to make it a little smaller. You can double curl it if you need to. There we go. And now we've got our tape. And we're gonna place this wherever we feel like this person should be. I'm gonna put my person a little off center, like this. And so now we have our 3D folding landscape. And just remember, since this is curling like it is, you're gonna want to put a heavy book on top of it overnight, and then it'll be straight. And this is really cool to have in your house, and it teaches you about the different layers of your landscapes.